These are the top 10 opening traps that you absolutely need to know in order to get to the rating of 1500 and if you want to make your opponents rage. The first trap occurs in the French defense, that's why we're playing black here. At this point, you are attacking this pawn in the 4, and in most cases, they're going to push it forward, choosing the so-called advanced variation. Now you attack their center, they support it, you play knight c6, adding more pressure to their center, and at some point, your opponents are likely to play bishop b5, especially if your opponents are not expert players. They're trying to pin your knight to reduce the pressure onto their center. Now, or they may first play knight f3, then you also develop the knight, and then they go bishop b5. Now, as they do so, and they pin your knight, you then play bishop d7, pretending like you just neutralized the pin. And the most played move by white here would be to castle kingside, but it turns out to be a very sudden blunder, because so far both sides sort of played normal development moves, but now, out of a clear blue sky, you've got this knight takes e5 shocking move. This opens up this discovered attack, and therefore if they take your knight, you just recapture this bishop, hit the rook, and life's good. On the other hand, if they take this bishop on d7, now you don't have to lose the knight on e5, because it just retreats back to d7, and you snatch the pawn on e5, fooled your opponent, and you end up with a good position. How about white choosing to play the Queen's Gambit? In this case, you can choose the so-called Albin counter gambit, and this is an absolutely must-know trap for you right here. Now, in this position, since white can't develop their knight normally because of your pawn, it's very tempting for your opponents to go pawn to e3, offering this trade of pawns. Because if black chooses to take here, that would be a really terrible decision. White would trade queens, force your king to move, and just end up with an endgame with an extra pawn. But you ruin their fun by going bishop to b4 check, known as the Lasker trap. Now, just based on the title of this trap, because it's named after the second world chess champ, you can say that it's a pretty old stuff, but nevertheless, people keep falling for this trap over and over again. So they need to cover their king somehow, and then, instead of taking right here, all of a sudden you take the pawn on e3. You capitalize on this pin and on the fact that this time, white can't take this pawn with the bishop because the bishop is pinned. Certainly they could capture with a pawn, but that's also not so easy because now these pawns are weak, plus there is always this queen h4 check. There are some troubles for white right here. But of course your opponent, if he's unfamiliar with a trap, the very obvious question he'll have is, hey, how about this hanging bishop on b4? Maybe you just miscalculated something. But if he grabs the bishop, the surprises keep coming. Instead of taking here on d1, you then toss in this in-between check to his king. At this point, your opponent may realize that he actually cannot take this pawn, because then the queen on d1 will be left undefended and you can go ahead and take it. If they try to keep defending the queen by going king to e2, then you've got an absolutely brutal move. You take this knight on g1 and you use some dark magic to turn the white knight into the black knight, like this. And you're not just flexing here, it's actually the best move in the position, because in this case, you're also capturing a knight with a check, leaving no time for white to do anything constructive. So they don't have time to take the queen because they need to guard the king. If they just take your knight, then bishop g4 is a brilliant skewer, and now you overpower them completely and win the game. Even if your opponent keeps his cool and realizes that he can't take the knight, he needs to move the king right here, by this time it's too late. He's gone. You go queen h4, checking the king, your knight still takes away this e2 square, and after g3, your queen slides over to e4 with this double attack, and on the next move you're going to grab the rook, and somehow, ironically, you consequently captured his knight and his rook standing on deep into their side of the board and somehow delivered this crushing attack. The next classical and must-know trap occurs against the Sicilian defense. Here you go for the Smith-Morra gambit, gambiting a pawn for quick development, and then your opponent realizes that knight f6 does not seem to be appealing, as soon as he brings the knight out, you'll play e5 and kick this knight back to where it started. Therefore, he wants to go d6 first to control the square and also to open up a diagonal for his bishop. But then you bring your bishop out, and if he goes knight f6, which seems like such a natural developing move, you then play e5, kicking off the knight and sacrifice the pawn, because if the pawn is captured, you come up with this tactic, bishop takes f7, still deflecting the king, and then grabbing the queen on d8 and winning the game. The next trap will allow you to trick the trickster and will definitely catch your opponents off guard. Some of your opponents will play here queen to 3. This move is surprisingly popular. Initially, you'd normally assume that Scholar's checkmate would only be used by some total beginners, but in reality, Queen f3 here is the second most played move ahead of a lot of normal developing moves by white, because your opponent hopes for potentially this Scholar's mate in case you overlook it, or maybe you pre-moved bishop c5 or something like that. But what they also hope for is that if you just play knight f6, something like that, then they will just complete their normal development and the game goes on. So here's how to trick the trickster. Instead of defending this pawn, you boldly move it forward, which totally shocks your opponent. Not only you're not defending this pawn, but you're letting them capture it in two different ways. In most cases, they're going to capture with a queen, insisting on their checkmating pattern. But if they capture it with a pawn, that's also not a problem. You then play knight f6, going for d5 on the next move, hitting the bishop. Knight to d4 is coming, threatening both the queen and as well as this pawn. Then your bishop will recapture this pawn on f5, and oh no, you've got a great position. Back to the main line, queen takes f5, your opponent thinks that you're doing something stupid, and now queen to f7 is coming, but then you play pawn d5, giving up the second pawn in a row. Your opponent is still clueless, and ironically, most of your opponents will capture this pawn on d5. Again, even if they notice the trap, by now it's too late. This is in fact a double attack to their queen and bishop. Therefore, inevitably, they're going to lose at least one of these two pieces. But in most cases, they're going to capture this pawn, still hoping for the checkmate, but instead you just grab their queen and win the game. Another must-know trap for you is the so-called Blackburne-Schilling Gambit with knight to d4, gambiting this pawn on e5. If you are an experienced player, you may be thinking, oh, everyone knows this. But the reality is knight takes c5 is still the second most played move in the position. Moreover, even if your opponent is familiar with the trap, usually they end up just playing some casual, simple development moves, nothing special, and therefore you can get away with it and end up with an equal position. Anyways, if they play knight takes e5, which is the main line of the trap, seems extremely good for white. They grab the pawn, they keep attacking, but you refute that with queen g5, with another sudden double attack to the knight as well as the pawn on g2. And if they keep moving the knight forward with knight takes f7, this time forking your heavy pieces, you once again counter-strike with queen takes g2, and now they're gone. The rook needs to move. If the rook moves, you play queen takes e4, back with this check. Notice that the e2 square is controlled by your knight, therefore they can't cover with the queen. In this case, they're going to lose it. And if they cover with the bishop, you've got this sneaky, beautiful checkmate, knight f3. Not many players realize that there is also a more advanced way of using basically the same trap, but this time it's going to work even against experienced opponents. As you go knight f6, the two knights game, and they're going for this fried liver attack, you play d5 to close the diagonal, and after pawn takes, instead of going for the main line with knight to a5 hitting their bishop, you can jump forward with your knight to d4. Now, your opponent might be tempted to push the pawn forward to free the bishop and to renew their main threat of knight takes f7, and then you sort of walk into their threat, you play queen takes d6, they happily grab this pawn with this double attack, but then you have queen c6, a really strong, powerful counterattack, and there's no way back for white from here. Now, queen c6 is really powerful because it attacks the bishop. The bishop can't move away because it needs to guard this knight, plus the queen also hits this pawn on g2, and you just overpower them. They can't defend all of their weaknesses. For example, if they decide to bite the bullet and just grab this rook in the corner, you then play queen takes g2, hitting the rook, and once the rook moves, you already know the pattern. You slide back to e4, check, and as you can see, it's basically the same thing. The bishop needs to move, if not, you're going to grab their queen, but if the bishop moves, it's still the same checkmate. There is also an old opening called the Ponziani opening, but it's really tricky. Your opponents will usually play knight f6. Some of them will, by the way, play bishop c5, which is a bad mistake. It walks right into your pawn to d4 advancement, which gives you an additional tempo. Nevertheless, most will play knight f6, then you still play d4, hitting them in the middle of the board, and now they've got a choice. They can either take this pawn or this pawn. If they take this one, it allows you to also play this in-between move e5, gaining a tempo, but if they capture this one, then you've got the move pawn to d5, kicking the knight back. As the knight goes, you recapture a pawn on e5. And even though the following trap seems to be known and old, the next move of your opponent is just so tempting and natural that it remains to be by far the most played move of black, pawn d6. It opens up the diagonal for the bishop, hits your knight, seemingly wins a tempo. What more can you ask for from a move? Well, the other thing is, it also loses the game because of bishop b5, and that strong move is the refutation. Because of your bishop controlling these diagonal as well as your knight controlling these two squares, there is no convenient way for them to cover the king without losing material. So c6 is the way to go, but then you recapture, and now the bishop is really strong. It x-rays the king, threatens all sorts of discover checks on the next move, therefore they have no time for anything. They can't easily recapture on c6 because as a result of this trade, you've got this triple attack onto their pieces with a check as well. What you need to know here is that your opponent here has got a really sneaky counter trap. It's the move queen to b6, which looks like just an attempt to attack your bishop. But then you might be thinking, hey, what's the problem? I've got this counter strike, checking his king, and now I'm going to grab the rook. So if he takes my bishop, no problem, I'm going to grab the rook and promote. But then your opponent plays another mysterious move, king d8. It seems very strange, and it's very easy for you to mess up. Because if you grab the rook, he will not take the bishop. He will instead all of a sudden play queen takes f2 checkmate. That's what he's hoping for. That is why you shouldn't take the rook here. You need to play knight f7, another in-between check. The king needs to move, and now you still shouldn't take and promote into a queen. You should use some dark magic and add the third knight on the board, which is the under promotion, adding the third knight and a fork to his king and queen. Absolutely brilliant. The next attacking pattern may work across different openings. I'll show you one of the variations, but in reality it can work from different opening situations. Let's say you're going for this Goring Gambit, where you sacrifice a pawn for quick development, and then let's say they go d6, bishop c4. In these positions, lots of your opponents will be tempted to go bishop g4, pinning your knight. And by the way, if they don't play this move, you always have some knight g5 ideas to hit this pawn on f7. Therefore, bishop g4 is not only an attacking move, but also sort of a prophylactic move for them. Now, as you castle, they might be tempted to make use of this pin and play knight to e5, which adds more pressure and also attacks your bishop. Now, lots of the players here who are not familiar with the following tactic would just passively retreat their bishop back to e2. But I hope that you do know a much stronger move, which is knight takes e5. You actually sacrifice your queen, because now this diagonal is open, and as they accept it, you then play bishop takes f7, and it's actually a checkmate. The next trap is paradoxical. It does not work against beginners because they're too weak to fall for the trap. Let me explain. So here, as we enter the Queen's Gambit, the main line, knight c3, bishop g5, and there is a move knight to d7. Now, it sets a really nice trap along the way. It actually does develop your knight, which is a perfectly fine move for you to play, but at the same time, you do not neutralize the pin on your knight. Therefore, some of your opponents may realize that they can actually trade on d5 and then make use of the pin by taking this pawn on d5. That's why I said that this trap only works against intermediate to advanced level opponents, because weak opponents simply miss the opportunity to take this pawn on d5. At the very same time, there were players with a blitz rating of 2700 to 8800 who fell for this trap. So knight takes d5 seems to be really strong, but you can refute it by giving up the queen and then counter-striking with bishop b4. This comes as a really unpleasant surprise. At this point, your opponent is going to realize that there is no piece to cover the king other than their own queen, so they have to give it back by playing queen to d2. And now you can take it, or even not take, but just take this bishop on d8. Because of this pin, the queen cannot run away, and therefore you're going to end up with an extra piece in an endgame. You're up a knight in an endgame, you still threaten this knight to c2 fork, and you've got a winning advantage. This time we're dealing with the Sicilian Defense, one of the very commonly played openings. Now you go for the so-called Alpine variation, going for d4 with this strong center. In these positions, very often your opponents will at some point play d5, either straight away or more frequently, they'll first bring the knight out and then you play d4, hitting their center. Now they realize that if they do nothing special, your opponent will keep marching forward and will kick off this knight. Therefore, they wish to stop it and they go d5 themselves, also counterattacking your center. After the trade, they now put pressure down to this isolated pawn on d4, which actually looks pretty good for them. Therefore, you defend it. Now they realize that they need to do something. Again, if they just play like passive defensive moves or just developing moves, you're going to play knight c3, kick this queen away, then push the pawn forward, kick this knight away, and it's not really very appealing for them. Therefore, they keep putting pressure. They go bishop g4, this time pinning the knight and threatening to capture it. So you pretend to defend it. And at this point, your opponent will calculate the following variation. He realizes that he can take the knight which was a defender of this pawn, and as you recapture, he then takes it, and what he calculates is white takes, I take, I'm up a pawn, I've got this strong knight on d4, life's good. But you ruin the fun with bishop takes c6, which is an in-between check. They have to recapture it, but now the queen on d4 is no longer defended, and you go ahead and simply grab it. While it's useful to know opening traps, certainly it is not the main way to progress. And if you're serious about it, you may wish to check out this free masterclass where I share some of the most efficient chess training methods that my students used to progress pretty rapidly within just a couple of months. So again, if you're curious, check this out.